A very dangerous potential escalation. We had a situation yesterday where President Zelensky spoke to Congress and asked for an increase in the U.S. military commitment to Ukraine. He asked for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And we're here to say that a no-fly zone would be a terrible idea. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy. It must stop. The Russian troops must withdraw. We need a ceasefire. We need negotiations. But a no-fly zone is absolutely the wrong step to take. Does everyone know what a no-fly zone really is? It's a fairly recent innovation in modern warfare. I think we first started to hear about a no-fly zone over Iraq in the 90s. But a no-fly zone over Ukraine, what that would mean is a commitment to shoot down Russian jets if they entered that zone. That they could be shot down by U.S. or NATO jets. They could also be shot down by ground anti-aircraft. So that would mean, in other words, a no-fly zone over Ukraine is the threat of direct military combat between the U.S. and Russia. And I probably don't have to tell you that the U.S. and Russia are the two largest military powers on the globe, and they are the two largest nuclear powers on the globe. U.S. forces and Russian forces have never exchanged fire, maybe since like the 1919 or 1920, but not in a long time, not since World War II. That has never happened. And that would be an unimaginably dangerous development for the entire world, not just for the peoples of U.S., Ukraine, and Russia, because such a conflict could go nuclear, right? Russian military doctrine allows the possibility of using nuclear weapons if they are losing conventionally. So does the U.S. nuclear doctrine. So there is every possibility that if shooting starts between U.S. forces and Russian forces, that it could go nuclear. And when a nuclear war starts in a tit-for-tat, the generals on each side tend to escalate. It's been shown in war game after war game that if that shooting starts, if they cross the nuclear threshold, it will probably escalate to World War III. And that would mean the end of human civilization as we know it. So we are walking on a tightrope. We can't allow a no-fly zone over Ukraine, even though we might sympathize with the people of Ukraine. We can't do that. Another thing we can't do, and by the way, the Boston Globe editorialized in favor today of that Poland should give its jets to Ukraine. Poland has MiG jets that were made by the Soviet Union. The same kind of jets that the Ukrainian Air Force flies. So there's talk of Poland giving some of its jets to Ukraine, and then the U.S. would replace Polish jets with American jets. Those jets would fly from NATO airfields in Poland or in one of the Eastern European NATO countries. And that would again mean direct combat between NATO and Russia. We can't afford those risks. There's talk of negotiations. I mean, there are serious negotiations. The Financial Times yesterday reported there's a 15-point agreement between Russia and Ukraine that is on the table. And that would not settle all outstanding issues, but it would settle a whole bunch of issues. It would be a major step towards peace. We need to see that move forward. We need to see the United States get much more involved in the diplomatic process. U.S. and Russian top officials haven't spoken since this started. I think Jake Sullivan is supposed to speak today to Lavrov. Let's hope that those are taken seriously, because the issues here don't just affect Russia and Ukraine, they affect the entire world. So we're here to say, in response to President Zelensky, no escalation. We can't afford U.S. involvement in this war. This is not America's war, and we can't afford to escalate for the sake of humanity. I'd like to call on Jackie King to say a few words.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to briefly remind us that
I'm sorry, may I interrupt you? Just for the live stream, can we get people to come closer in so you look more of a group hanging together, shoulder to shoulder? Thank you. Keep
We don't want to show the science to ourselves.
Okay, whatever. Well, all right.
I wanted to briefly remind us of what happened leading up to this war. The United States and NATO have a profound responsibility for what is going on. We can condemn unequivocally the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and at the same time, we can recognize that the U.S. and NATO, despite many promises made in 1990, have expanded step by step, country by country, to the borders of Russia. And Russia repeatedly said that Ukraine was a red line. They feel threatened and defensive, or that's what was happening leading up to the war. It would not have been so hard to negotiate a peaceful settlement, as many scholars and independent journalists have described. They could, Ukraine could become a neutral country like Austria or Switzerland or Finland or others, and maintain its independence and sovereignty, and yet not be directly threatening Russia. And the U.S. was unwilling to even discuss it. They just sneered at that proposal and tossed it back and said no, they wouldn't even talk, and then acted surprised when that heightened tensions enormously. So we can feel deep sympathy for the Ukrainian people and the refugees and the enormous suffering this war has unleashed, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge the responsibility of our own government. This is where we live. This is the government we could influence. And when these two nuclear-armed nations are squaring off against each other in a very, very dangerous spiral, this is, we need to influence our own government and say, de-escalate, step back from the brink, negotiate in good faith, and bring an end to this conflict. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Let me call on Kim from the Answer Coalition to speak.
A little high for me. Awesome. Really great to see everyone out here today. So I want to start off with a few chants just to get the blood pumping a little bit. Yes. Thank you. Thanks. What do we want? Peace. When do we want it? Now. What do we want?
Peace.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Peace.
When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Peace.
When do we want it?
Now.
If we don't get it, shut it down. If we don't get it,
Shut it down.
if we don't get it,
Shut it down.
if we don't get it, shut it down. What do we want? Peace. When do we want it? Now. What do we want?
Peace.
When do we want it?
Now.
If we don't get it,
Shut it down.
if we don't get it,
Shut it down.
if we don't get it,
Shut it down.
Awesome. Peace. So my name is Kim, and I'm an organizer with the Answer Coalition, which is Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. And we were actually formed in the wake of the September 9/11 attacks and have been fighting since then against war, against militarism, against racism, and the root cause of it all, imperialism. So I really want to thank Mass Peace Action today and all the organizers of this rally for coming together so quickly during these really dangerous times that we're living in. And, don't need to, repeat it again, but these are very dangerous and perilous times. But one thing is clear, I think more war is absolutely not the answer. And I want to acknowledge to anyone who may be listening here that people are understandably shocked and horrified by the war in Ukraine. War is an absolutely terrible thing. It brings out the worst in humanity. And now with Ukrainian President Zelensky demanding a no-fly zone in front of Congress yesterday, many around us, the mainstream media, people that we know and trust, are also calling for a no-fly zone, thinking that this is the answer to peace. But in fact, we know the opposite is true. So I want to start off with just talking a little bit more about what a no-fly zone even is, and I'm thankful that Cole started to touch on this already. So has anyone even heard of a no-fly zone? I think some of us have started to discuss this already, but really what that means is that any Russian plane that flies over the Ukraine would be shot down. A no-fly zone may seem like an innocuous thing, but really it's a clear escalation of war. I want folks to remember that. A no-fly zone is an escalation of war. And despite all the media clamor that we're hearing about the situation right now, recent polls are actually showing that most Americans would in fact disapprove of a no-fly zone if it were to be seen as an act of war. And so why isn't the media pointing to this as the question? Because that is the question. And we need to be clear that this is what's happening. A no-fly zone is an escalation and an act of war. A no-fly zone would compel U.S. warplanes and missile batteries to shoot down Russian military aircraft. Rather than a move to end the war, it would lead to a global confrontation between the U.S., NATO, and Russia, and it could even lead to a nuclear war. No-fly zones were imposed in the war against Yugoslavia in 1999 as a pretext for NATO to bomb the country out of existence. In 2011, a no-fly zone was imposed on Libya, and NATO bombed that country to the point to where Libya is now a failed state, and there is open chattel slavery in the streets. And if you doubt me in any way, please look it up right now. This is true, and this is a reality of the world we live in today. And so, thinking about this imposition of a no-fly zone, it would be the absolute quickest way to a nuclear war with Russia. That is what that means, which would be a war to end all wars, a war that wipes out humanity and all life on it. And so in these dangerous times, many of us here are asking the question, how can peace then be achieved? What is the answer to the current situation? And I want us to also, just focus on this question of, we are concerned people here about peace. We are against war and we are for peace. The people of the world, we want peace. After 3 years of a global pandemic and this capitalist government's abysmal response, we are now teetering on the brink of another world war unlike what we've seen before. And peace, as many of us may know, can only be achieved through building a movement, the anti-war movement. But we also know that this movement has to be an anti-racist movement because these twin evils work hand in hand. And we have to address the fact that African people, even in the Ukraine, are not being treated like human beings. It means also calling out the racist, Russophobic propaganda and the attacks on everyday Russian people who are the ones who are suffering at the hands of these sanctions that have been imposed by the U.S. And peace can absolutely not be achieved if we continue down this course set by U.S. imperialism and NATO. Peace can only be achieved by building a movement, this anti-war movement. And NATO is a Cold War relic that must be abolished as a precursor for peace. And this, I will say it again, is a precondition that we need to achieve any lasting, sustainable peace. And no one is going to save us from this war. No one but ourselves, everyone here and everyone listening. We have to want peace more than the warmongers in the Pentagon want war. And we have to talk to everyone we know about what is really at stake here. Our lives, my life, your life, her life, and the life of this planet. A no-fly zone is not a de-escalation. It is an escalation, and the answer must be a struggle for peace. So the question we also need to ask ourselves is, what do working people, every one of us here, what do we gain from this war? And what are our interests here? Throughout history, we know the vast majority of wars have been fought by poor and working people, while the rich elites are the ones who are starting the war, and they're the ones continuing the war and the ones who are financially benefiting from it. Here in the state of Massachusetts, gas prices, heating prices, and even housing prices have been rapidly increasing. This is not just a Massachusetts phenomenon, though. This is a national phenomenon. And it is tied to the war drive. In the last month, the Biden administration has increased funding for Ukraine's army from $3 to $4 billion to $10 billion. $10 billion. And is considering adding another $800 million to this war drive. And this is when we have hungry families and children, homelessness, poverty deepening, and our leaders are chomping at the bit to give more billions of dollars to this war. And as the late and great Tupac Shakur famously said, they got money for war but can't feed the poor. They got money for war but they can't feed the poor. What an abomination. Working people like us, we gain nothing from this. We gain absolutely nothing from this war drive. We're the ones who get the higher gas prices, the refugee crisis, the wage freezes, and we can't even get fully funded services after a 3-year pandemic because of this war drive. And so if we want peace, we have to face the facts. NATO and the US are the main instigators of this calamity. NATO is an outdated and highly destructive organization that has annihilated countries like Yugoslavia and also most recently Libya. So if we want peace, I will say it again, we have to abolish NATO and we have to fight racism hand in hand with imperialism. Too long, U.S. militarism and war have been paid at the expense of our crumbling cities. We have no national health care system. We have no real sustainable child care program for parents. Our student debt, here's a student, our student debt is going through the roof year after year. Where's the check, Joe Biden? We haven't gotten our checks yet. And so the U.S. is driving NATO's continued expansion, and it's up to us to oppose this. And finally, I want to end with, some thoughts on this speech that Zelensky gave, because I think it was really quite interesting, his words yesterday. He actually quoted Martin Luther King Jr. in his opening speech, and he defamed Dr. King's name and legacy in order to push for more war. We can't fall for these theatrical tricks, and we must uphold King's legacy, a peacemaker, an anti-racist, an anti-war activist, and a socialist. We have to draw upon this rich legacy of anti-war activism in this country. As Dr. King said, he didn't just have a dream. It is no longer a choice, my friends, between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. And the alternative to disarmament, the alternative to greater suspension of nuclear tests, the alternative to strengthening the United Nations and thereby disarming the whole world, may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation, and our earthly habitat would be transformed into an inferno that even the mind of Dante could not imagine. So we must push today and every day for an end to the war. We must push for de-escalation, and we must push for peace. They say more war, we say no war. They say we say no war. They say more war. We say no war. What do we want? Peace. When do we want it?
Now.
What do we want?
Peace.
When do we want it?
Now.
If we don't get it, shut it down. If we don't get it,
Shut it down.
if we don't get it, shut it down. Thank you.
We need a volunteer to hand out leaflets to passers-by. Paul Shannon has the leaflets. If you can help him, please walk over there and get some of his leaflets. Now I'd like to call on Jane Binkert from the Boston May Day Coalition.
Hi everyone, my name is Jane Binkert. I'm a member of the Boston May Day Coalition, and I'm representing the Boston. Hi. Again, I'm representing the Boston May Day Coalition. We have a statement here from our coalition. We are called upon to demand that all outstanding issues be negotiated. Boston May Day Coalition demands that Washington take the no-fly zone off the table. We demand that all U.S. forces be immediately withdrawn from Europe. We demand that all nuclear weapons be immediately be removed from Europe. These issues are not even on the table, yet they are central to the conflict in Ukraine. Eastern Europe has outsourced foreign policy to Washington. Is that exercising self-determination? We are told to focus on Putin. Putin is being portrayed as the cause of all evil. We can then ignore all the broken promises we've had to endure. The U.S. has lost nearly 1 million people to COVID-19. Almost 1,000 yesterday alone. One of the worst death rates in the world. Should we forget? Should we forget that and demonize the Russians? The devastation of Ukraine is terrible. We should all denounce this, but what about Yemen? The death and devastation there is horrific. Saudi Arabia, with United States weapons, has been bombing them into the Stone Age. Does Washington give a damn? Do the European leaders give a damn? Do the Eastern European leaders give a damn? Racism is also an outstanding issue in this conflict, and let's face it, Yemenis are not white. Neither are the thousands of Colombians murdered by the regime. Neither are the Palestinians. Does Washington give a damn about them? No. No. Neither are the Palestinians. Okay, we know this. I, for one, have no confidence in Washington negotiating anything good. I would not trust these people with a penknife. The Pentagon is not defending us. They are defending the millionaires and billionaires. Cut the war budget 100%. We need to organize our own defense as working people. Working people here in the United States, in Ukraine, in Europe, in Russia. We need our own foreign policy. A policy that defends us, not the wealthy. Developing our foreign policy starts with us and what we need as working people. What we demand should not depend upon the lies of Washington or the profits of Wall Street. We should demand that nuclear weapons be immediately removed from Europe. We should demand that all war cease. All these sanctions are actions of war. We know that. Sanctions are war. They are backed up by force. They are hurting everyone. End all sanctions now. If we focus on these demands, then we will have more effectiveness on Washington. A quote from Caitlin Johnstone. If you say you hate this war, but get upset when people talk about the known ways the U.S. centralized empire helped cause it, then your interest is not in peace, nor in truth, but in loyalty to that empire. I say it's time not to be loyal to the empire. Thank you.
I'm Susan Mirsky here from Mass Peace Action Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. And I'm usually here with a nice sign that says Grandmothers for Peace. But here today, I'm with a sign that says no to no-fly zone. negotiate, don't escalate, because no-fly zone threatens a nuclear war, threatens our children everywhere. So let's hear it. No to no-fly zone. Negotiate, don't escalate. No to no-fly zone. Negotiate, don't escalate. No to no-fly zone. Negotiate, don't escalate. No to no-fly zone. Negotiate, don't escalate.
I'm here. My name is Paul Shannon. I'm here because I'm a human being. It is time for us to focus on the dangers that lay in front of us. And irresponsible media and members of Congress have been calling for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Sounds like a great idea. What happens when the first Russian plane is shot down by an American plane? What happens when an American plane is shot down by a Russian anti-aircraft battery? What comes next? And after what comes next, what comes after that? And then what? A no-fly zone is a dangerous first step in the direction of a nuclear war that would eliminate the human race. And that's why I'm here. If this isn't bad enough, we must make sure that we never face this situation again. Whatever you think about Russia, whatever you think about this war, whatever you think about the people of Ukraine and the suffering that they're going through, the approach of setting up a no-fly zone is not the way to go. It is a step toward the incineration of Ukraine and toward full-scale nuclear war. Just look at the insane situation we are in right now. Russia and the United States each have enough nuclear weapons to wipe out most of humanity, and those who may still be alive would die from nuclear winter, which would follow any significant nuclear exchange. This is crazy that the human race, that our country, that our Russia, that all the nuclear powers have let it come to this, that we have to worry about whether an engagement between the United States and Russia would lead to our elimination as human beings. The first step is to make sure that the option of a no-fly zone is taken off the table. Step number one. We may disagree on a lot of things about this war, but we have to agree on step number one. The no-fly zone must be taken off the table. Then, if we can accomplish that, all our effort must go into making sure that nuclear weapons are abolished so that we never find ourselves in this insane situation again. There is a United Nations treaty to end all nuclear weapons everywhere. We must mobilize ourselves, Russians, Ukrainians, everyone on Earth to support that treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons so that these terrible wars between nations are not allowed to move to the point where humanity is eliminated. Today, take no-fly zone off the table. Members of Congress, members of the media, look at what you are proposing. Come to your senses. Stop saying such insane things that will escalate to who knows what. Whatever your political persuasion, nuclear war is the enemy of all of us. We must not allow an escalation that leads to nuclear war. And the first step is taking the no-fly zone off the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. Now I'd like to call on Winston Warfield, who's with Veterans for Peace. Winston.
I don't know what to add to this, other than kind of my perspective. Haven't had military experience. We haven't really talked a lot about that, and it might be important to think about. The Russian military is extremely powerful nowadays. They have had a new revolution in military affairs, and tangling with the Russian military is just going to lead to disaster. We've talked about this no-fly zone, and people have been focusing on Russian planes getting shot down. I think the reverse would mostly be true. NATO planes would be getting shot down because Russia has the most advanced anti-air systems in the world now. The other thing I wanted to point out is we've been talking a lot about the refugee crisis, and I didn't hear anybody mention today that the refugee crisis and the civilian casualty crisis didn't just start with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It started in 2014 with the coup and the fascist assault on the Donbass by groups like the Azov Battalion. 14,000 people in Donetsk and Lugansk have been killed by random artillery and sniper fire, which is conveniently forgotten in this country, and also by the peace movement, because it's more, I don't know, simpatico and feels better to think things started with Putin's invasion. But there was definitely a development that led up to that, and my personal opinion is that the only resolution to this crisis is to negotiate and actually accept Russia's demands and negotiating positions at the table. That's the only way out of this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Win. The next up is Kaya Vanderzeel of the Physicians for Social Responsibility. Kaya.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry that we all have to be here. I haven't prepared anything, but some of my colleagues have written. Oh, sorry. Some of my colleagues have written something that I will try to abridge so that you get the general idea. I am a retired physician myself, and we have active and retired physicians working in our group, Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. So two of my colleagues wrote, "Those of us working in healthcare have joined the rest of the world in shock and horror watching the Russian military's attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including a maternity ward and children's hospital in Mariupol last week." As food, water, transportation, and sewage and water infrastructure fail, a larger wave of sickness and death will follow the initial bombing, as civilians face food insecurity, infectious disease, and exacerbations of chronic medical conditions. The disaster currently unfolding would be multiplied to unimaginable proportions if the current conflict escalated to involve nuclear weapons. And that path to nuclear weapons has been carefully laid out by others before me. The approximately 12,000 nuclear weapons in Russia and NATO's arsenals today include many strategic weapons that are orders of magnitude more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The impossible needle that Western leaders must thread in this moment is how to protect and help Ukrainian civilians without escalating the conflict to a point of nuclear war. This is a very difficult proposition. Given the dangers of nuclear exchange, the administration's steadfastness in not escalating to direct conflict with Russia, and its insistence in setting up direct lines of communication with the Russian military deserve praise. If the world survives this conflict, we will need to regard it as a wake-up call to dismantle the system of global security that keeps us all in danger of extinction. As members of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and its U.S. affiliate, Physicians for Social Responsibility, we are carrying on this work which was started early in the Cold War. Our current system of nuclear deterrence makes many false assumptions that all actors in geopolitics are states, that those states act rationally in their own interest. Our organizations are involved in efforts to educate about nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons have faded from the public's consciousness since the end of the Cold War, but as the current conflict shows, their existence remains as a threat to ours. We must find a way, as impossible as it seems, to peacefully resolve this conflict, as President Zelensky himself said in an interview with Vice News last week. And then we must turn our attention to the existential threat that these weapons pose. I'd just like to add that many people think, well, we'll just use a small nuke. And that a small nuke invites retaliation. And pretty soon we are plunged into a new nuclear winter here, and with many starving. Those unlucky enough not to have died in the first onslaught of the weapons will gradually starve to death, and all life will end on this planet.
We get to wrap because of the rain. Oh, you're done? Yeah. Okay. All right, thank you, Kay, and thank you everyone for turning out. We are going to wrap because it's starting to rain, and we don't want to get our beautiful sound system wet. Thank you all for coming. Please keep up the pressure. Contact Congress, and we have a webinar tonight with Ben Norton where we're going to be talking about some of the back history of the Ukraine conflict and so on. So that's another opportunity to learn more. Thank you for coming.